I'm here today with Chris Stedman. Chris is an activist and community organizer who has written for The Guardian, The Atlantic, Pitchfork, BuzzFeed, and Vice, and has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, and PBS. He was the founding executive director of the Yale Humanist Community and is now adjunct professor at Augsburg University. His first book was Facets, How an Atheist Found Common Ground with the Religious, and he has a new book coming out from Broadleaf Books in October called IRL, Finding Realness, Meaning, and Belonging in Our Digital Lives, which is a topic that's a very high interest to me. So I'm really glad to have Chris here to discuss this with us today. So thanks for joining us, Chris.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So before we dive into the book, I'd really love to hear more about you and your background and what you're doing now.
Sure. Yeah, so I spent the better part of the last decade working as a humanist community builder and chaplain. So I served as a humanist chaplain at Harvard University for 4 years before going down to New Haven, Connecticut to help build and direct the humanist community there, which I also did for 4 years. And during that time, I was primarily working with the population of young people, although we always sort of opened our programs to the broader community. And we I'd say oftentimes it was about 50-50, 50% sort of non-university affiliates and 50% university affiliates. But for the better part of the last decade, I've been working with people who fall outside of sort of traditional religious categories or who don't identify with a religious category as they work to make sense of their lives, discern what matters most to them and what their responsibility is to the world around them. And so a few years ago, I moved back to my home state of Minnesota for a number of reasons, including to sort of be closer to family and help with some family stuff. And when I did so, I started working with some researchers at the University of Minnesota and UMass Boston to study the religiously unaffiliated, to better understand where people who are not religious find a sense of belonging, a sense of community, where they locate their values, how they make sense of their lives, what practices they use. And in that process, I just kept noticing more and more, both in my work with those researchers and also just sort of in my own life and in conversations with people, that digital spaces were increasingly a part of how people were making sense of their lives. And as people have sort of been moving more and more out of the institutions through which many of us have kind of historically grappled with these kinds of questions, and they're moving more of that work into a sort of more individual digital experience. And so I wanted to try and understand why we're doing that, how we're doing that, in what ways that sort of shapes how we understand what it means to be human, and what the internet can sort of show us about ourselves, and how we sort of use the ways that we use digital space, what that kind of reveals about what it means to be human. And so the result of that, for the last 3 years, I've been sort of interviewing people, doing a bunch of reading and research and reflecting on my own experiences. And the result of that is this book, IRL. So, between working on that and now teaching in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Augsburg, that's been really, I think, the focus of the last few years of my life, and how it sort of grows out of my previous experiences as a humanist community builder and an interfaith activist.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, as I said, this topic is really fascinating to me. I mean, I'm a technology guy, in terms of my own background, and I've often, tried to think of the world in terms of, okay, let's think back 100 years, the way things were then, or 50 years or whatever. And now let's think about, okay, well, 50 years from now, or 100 years from now, or even 20 years from now, right? What is it going to look like,
Mm-hmm.
right? If we put ourselves, so we're in this midst of a transformation from a completely offline world to a more and more online world.
Yep.
Right? And so what does that mean? What does that mean for church? What does that mean for all kinds of things? I mean, we've seen incredible evolution already in, for instance, e-commerce, right? I mean, Amazon, the prime example of, and now with the pandemic having occurred, many of these transformations have accelerated.
Mm-hmm.
right? People's use of Amazon, people's use of Zoom, church services that are now online. And there were some before, not nearly as
Absolutely.
many as there have been over the last few months. So it just kind of has accelerated, the phenomenon of the way we used to live in a very geographically constrained manner to more and more of a less geographically constrained manner.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So often in the past, the ways that we found community and belonging was due to, the accident of birth, right? What families we were born into, where we were born, and less around sort of shared interests,
Yeah.
shared experiences. And, one thing I write about in IRL is an experience that because I sort of grew up in this kind of in-between generation, where the internet and sort of digital space was not a part of my sort of earliest formative experiences. I could bike to the library when I was in middle school and use the internet for 20 minutes at a time, or however long they let you use it before you had to give the computer to the next person. And I didn't have a smartphone until I was, in my first job at Harvard. And so, I've had many sort of, a lot of the work of developing my understanding of who I am, where I fit in the world, was done sort of pre-digitally or sort of mostly non-digitally. And yet, increasingly more and more of that work that continues to happen, right? Because we're always, we're forever sort of in process. It now happens in digital space. And so a lot of the book was me trying to kind of grapple with how has that changed the way that I understand myself, that I connect with others. And I think I really like your framing of it as this sort of transitional moment that we're in, because that's one of the things I talk about near the end of the book, is that we really are in this transitional moment between the pre-digital world and an increasingly digital world. And yet it's in those transitional moments, in those moments of change, where we have an opportunity to reapproach age-old questions about what it means to be human, what it means to belong, what it means to understand ourselves in new ways. We can sort of see them, from a new vantage point, and we can ask ourselves new questions of those. We can sort of say, when we have to kind of figure out new ways of connecting, new ways of belonging, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what does it mean to belong? What do I get out of connecting with others? And so in this sort of swirl of change and loss that we're experiencing as we're moving from a pre-digital world to a digital one, we have this chance, if we engage it sort of purposefully and intentionally, we have this chance to ask ourselves those questions in new ways. And that's kind of how the book opens, with me talking about this experience of going to a drag performance at a gay bar, and seeing, and it was amateur night. So it was a night when these drag performers are sort of trying drag for the first time. And I'm sort of reflecting on how I really like amateur night more so than the sort of more polished performances, precisely because on amateur night, you see people trying all kinds of different things, some that, don't work at all, but others that, are sort of risks that maybe a more polished performer might not take. They're, thinking less about sort of what is going to, what the audience is going to like, what's going to sell, and more about what they're trying to express. And watching those performances, I thought about how when I was in high school, my mom told me I had to go out for a sport, and I was really against the idea, but she kind of forced my hand. And so I went out for cross country, thinking at the time, I thought I was being very clever. And I was like, well, I'm so bad at running, there's no way I'll make the team. What I didn't understand is everyone makes the team in cross country. And so because of that, I ended up, by trying something, because prior to that point in my life, I mostly stuck to the activities that I was already good at, the things that sort of came naturally to me. But by being forced to try something that I wasn't good at, I actually learned through that process of being an amateur, as I put it in the book, or sort of being bad at something, or trying something that you're sort of not good at yet. I learned new things about myself. And I think so many of us feel, I certainly feel this way, that we're not good at the internet yet, that we're still figuring out
Oh,
how to do it,
absolutely.
how to human online, how to connect with others.
We're in the very
But
early stages of all of this.
exactly. But I think because like that also, like the transitional nature of this moment, that presents us an opportunity to, be bad at something and to learn through that kind of trial and error. And so, the last thing I want to say is to your point about the geography thing. When I was in middle school, I did not have regular access to the internet, but I could bike to the library and use it for a little bit. And it was there online that I first sort of came out to people as being gay. That was where I first Googled the word gay and was able to sort of connect with other people because I, at that point, we live in a very different world right now, but at that point, I saw no LGBT people around me. I didn't know anyone else who was, sort of struggling with the things that I was struggling with, but I could go online and I could forge very real connections that enabled me to sort of try that experiment with telling someone what it would feel like to tell someone that, so that then I could sort of practice that and then take it into other parts of my life.
Wow.
And so, I think we do ourselves a real disservice when we say that the internet isn't real, or the ways that we sort of connect with others or find a sense of belonging online isn't real, because I think the way that we describe things define what is possible of them, and just because our experience of the internet sometimes leads us in the direction of feeling less real, doesn't mean that that's how it has to be. And I think I think a lot of that is this sort of the growing pains of this transitional moment that we're in.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
I mean, we as humans have not been able to anywhere nearly adapt as quickly and as effectively as we will need to, right?
yeah, especially right now.
Especially right now. I mean, everyone's complaining about social media, right? All the terrible things about it. Well, guess what? It's just a more powerful communication tool, and any more powerful communication tool can be misused.
Mm-hmm.
and used very well, very positively. So, I mean,
yeah, there will always be loss in those changes. I mean, it's a tale as old as time, right? The invention of the printing press, scared people, and there was loss with it too. I mean, as oral traditions became less and less the ways that people, passed on information and stories, that changed the experience of learning new information, of hearing stories, to a more sort of individual experience rather than a kind of collective and community experience. And there is loss in that. So it's not, I think, the technological utopians who paint this sort of beautiful picture of technology as this thing that's sort of universally positive, are also not telling the truth, right?
Absolutely.
About the fact that we do lose things. But I think one thing that has really helped me is, and I think this is something that the pandemic has really driven home for me and for many other people I know, is I think if we expect an online experience to exactly replicate the kind of experience we can have offline, we'll be disappointed. We will feel like it's not real. But I think at one point in the book, I compare it to like vegan meats. Sometimes I don't always really enjoy them because they're trying to sort of recreate an experience, and yet, they can't recreate it exactly. And so it ends up feeling like something is amiss, like something's off about it. But I much prefer things like tofu or tempeh, because they are not trying to sort of exactly mimic an experience a different kind of experience, nor do I sort of go into eating them expecting them or thinking that they might sort of evoke the same feelings, have a similar taste, etc. And so I think I certainly have done this when, I am getting together with friends for a Zoom happy hour or whatever, if I expect it to be exactly the same as an offline happy hour, I'll probably be dissatisfied with the experience and I'll compare it unfavorably. But if I treat it as an opportunity to do so, to connect in a different way and recognize that there will be things about it that will be, inferior, but there also might be things about it that, I couldn't do offline. Like I can join a group of friends from across the country in a way that I couldn't for an offline happy hour. Then, that reframe allows me to not only focus on the sort of loss that I experience around that, but also recognize what is gained from it.
So I've just gone through a similar kind of experience within my own little neck of the woods with writing conferences. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I've traditionally done writing conferences in person, and because we're not able to do that this year, I shifted 2 large writing conferences online. And as part of that, I tried to replicate as much as I could, from an in-person experience, which obviously you can't do everything, to your point, you just can't replicate hugs or, other kinds of things online. But I also tried to add different kinds of experiences and features of the conference that you couldn't do offline, right? So that part of it, I think, I'm very conscious of trying to do that, to augment, the balance of, pros and cons. But one of the other aspects that I kept hearing from the attendees that they felt as though the experience was more intimate for them. In that, and I felt this myself, because if I'm sitting in a large room with a whole bunch of people, a lot of times I'll be wanting to sit near the back. I'll be futzing with my phone, checking email or whatever, instead of paying close attention. Whereas when I've been watching it on Zoom or on YouTube as the person was presenting, they're right in my face, right? What I mean? It's kind of like, and both in terms of the presentations and also in terms of the Q&A, people felt like there were deeper conversations. And again, more, people kept using the word intimate conversations.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking as you're talking about this, about the class I taught yesterday, so I'm teaching one of the required religion classes at Augsburg. And, so it ends up being a lot of students who are, and they're very honest about this, who are taking it because it's a required class.
Of course.
And so, but it's also because of that, it's at capacity. It's the largest class you can take at Augsburg. And yet there was something for sure about being in the Zoom room yesterday where, everyone's sort of right there on the screen. It's not this sort of mass of faces in a sort of lecture hall that I do think had a similar feeling. And likewise, I feel fortunate because I planned this class earlier this year knowing, I sort of built the syllabus and the structure for the class knowing that it was probably going to be online. And I definitely feel for a lot of my, fellow faculty right now who are trying to take something that they've done offline for years and sort of recreate it in a digital experience versus, I went into this knowing that it was going to be online. And so I was able to kind of plan and design a course knowing what the sort of limitations and advantages were going to be. And I think that is definitely that's one of the problems that we get ourselves into online is that, because it's so new, we haven't, I think I'll speak for myself anyway. It was like I woke up one day and realized oh my gosh, so much of my life is online now. And it's not just this space where I sort of go to share things that I've experienced offline. It's actually a place where life is happening now. And I kind of had this moment where I was like, well, when did that happen? Because it just sort of it happened so gradually that I didn't notice until all of a sudden it was kind of everywhere. And, I think because it's so new and because it sort of snuck up on many of us, we haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about, the fact that these increasingly important parts of how we connect with each other are now happening online. As you say, with the pandemic, we sort of, it became more of a necessity thing. But even prior to the pandemic, more and more of the ways that we connect with each other and make sense of our lives are happening online. And I think because of that, like, because it happened so sort of gradually and like we're not really aware of the fact, I think we feel often that we're sort of leaving institutions like churches or civic groups, and we're sort of moving our search for meaning, for belonging to a more sort of individual experience. But we don't really recognize that actually the internet itself is its own kind of institution, that has its own sort of norms and agendas, and those things are often sort of invisible to us, just as they can be in other kinds of institutions. And so I actually spent sort of early on in the process of working on the book, I spent a great amount of time in the map library at the University of Minnesota, because I was trying to understand how cartographers sort of take these complex three-dimensional terrains and reduce them down into something, into a representation that we can sort of understand, and how that's a process of kind of selection and curation, reduction. You know, you can't show everything on the map, otherwise the map would be the size of the territory it's depicting. But how, you know, and sort of drawing parallels to the ways that we sort of show up online, and the kind of selection and curation that happens there as we create these sort of digital representations. But what I realized as I was doing that was that those choices, those sort of selection, curatorial choices, are guided by these conventions that are often invisible to us. Like in map making, you know, it's not this sort of neutral process. The norms and conventions of cartography are informed by, you know, who's paying for the maps, who's funding, you know, and so like the map librarian I spoke with, you know, was referencing a map of Germany from the past, and how, you know, it depicted the king's Germany, right, not the peasants' Germany. And similarly, you know, I think we don't think of our digital spaces as being these sort of institutions, although I think the 2016 election certainly brought that to mind for more people, as we became more aware of how various sort of forces try to use social media to influence us. But, you know, I think we think of digital space as sort of neutral or artless, but the choices we make and the kinds of choices that we're even able to make online are absolutely shaped by these sort of norms and conventions that we're not always aware of. And that's another reason why I think digital life or digital connection can feel dissatisfying, not only because we expect it to replicate an offline experience, but because sometimes we come up against the edges of what's possible right now. You know, that doesn't mean that the internet can't be moved in the direction of other priorities, but right now it serves the interests, you know, it serves particular interests determined by particular people, oftentimes not, you know, you and me. I'm sure that's something you're very aware of, given your background.
Well, I mean, my background is predominantly business. And so, you know, money drives things. Money drives behavior.
Yeah.
Money drives investment. Money drives enhanced capabilities. So like one of the things that I'm thinking is going to happen is that it won't be terribly long before we can go to a concert and look like we're in row E, seat number 107, and it'll look exactly like, you know, it'll feel exactly like it is if we were there in person. That'll be over the internet. I mean, that kind of thing, right? You know, I think it's just a matter of the technology development, you know, call it virtual reality or whatever you want to, you know, the sound, the sight, probably even the feeling. You know, the bass tones, the smell.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I mean, well, when I was in college, you know, you went into a concert and it was just like the smell of marijuana was just like overwhelming. I mean,
Sure.
You know.
Yes, I remember actually. I have a very vivid memory of covering a concert for the school newspaper and referencing that fact, and my editors cutting it out. And at the time, I was so convinced that I was being censored.
Well, it was so overwhelming you couldn't avoid, you know, receiving that smell. But anyway, so yeah, I think, you know, a business, you know, money is going to end up driving a lot of.
Absolutely, I think, you know, the reason social media gets has a bad reputation sometimes is that, you know, there are in another chapter, one of the chapters, I use maps as this sort of metaphor. In another chapter, I use games and gameplay as this metaphor. And I reference, there's this idea of sort of passive play or deep play. So in passive play is more the kind of like mindless gaming, like, sitting at a slot machine, sort of hoping over and over again for the rush of that win. Whereas deep play is the kind of play where you're sort of forging meaningful connections, and this can happen in games, but it also can happen in life. Sometimes our experience on social media is one where we're sort of, what drives, ad revenue for social media platforms is people being online. And one way to really drive people to be online is to make them mad. And so, that kind of experience online can feel dissatisfying to people. It can feel like they're wasting their time but I've also spoken with people who have an experience of kind of deep play online. And sure enough, actually, there was a study out of BYU. There was this 8-year longitudinal study of social media use, and they found something that kind of runs contrary to this this notion that people have, which is that the more time you spend online, the unhappier you are. That's kind of been a driving, message in some of the sociology of sort of digital life for years. But they found actually that two people can spend the same amount of time online and have very different experiences. One can feel sort of more connected, more centered in themselves, and one can feel more disconnected, more frustrated. And that it had everything to do with sort of how purposeful the person was being with their time online. Someone who was sort of, mindlessly scrolling, driven by sort of, various algorithms making them upset, or, that's sort of one kind of experience someone can have online. But that someone can also spend just as much time online, but be engaged sort of more intentionally, more purposefully, et cetera, and have a very different experience. Now, that doesn't mean that it should all sort of boil down to individual behavior, right? It's like when we talk about climate change, individual behavior certainly matters, but until there's sort of systemic change to address those challenges, individual behavior can only get us so far. But that doesn't mean that individual behavior doesn't matter, and that we can't have an improved experience online in the internet as it is right now, if we're a little bit more purposeful about how we use it.
Well, here's a data point for you. When I decided that I was going to cancel my 6 conferences this spring, I was going to produce 6 in-person conferences between the end of March and the end of June. And so all that went away, right? So I was like, okay, what am I going to do now with all my time? And, so I started this interview series called Reading Hope in Trying Times, where I interviewed lots of different authors, activists, religious folks. And I ended up doing 78 of those interviews between the end of March and the beginning of June. 78. So I spent an awful lot of my time online. But it was in conversations like this, that were meaningful conversations, many of which were people that I just established a relationship with, first time that I ever talked to them. So for me personally, to your point about how you spend your time online, that was incredibly fruitful. And way better than in total the conversations that I would have had over a similar period in person. So for what it's worth, to your point about the value of being online, closely sort of correlated with how you spend that time.
Yeah, I also think it goes back to something you were saying earlier about what the experience of the sort of digital conference was versus an in-person one. It doesn't mean that I can't have a meaningful experience with someone in person. I absolutely can. But oftentimes when I get together with a friend in person, we'll be sort of ironically on our phones a little bit here and there, or distracted by this thing or that thing. But when I'm Zooming or FaceTiming with a friend, I'm having to kind of give them my direct attention. I'm not really engaged with anything else at all. And that definitely does facilitate a different kind of conversation, I've found.
Especially when a video involved.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That forces that to some degree.
Oh, totally. When I'm talking on the phone, I'm, doing dishes, I'm laundry and whatever else. Yeah.
So one of the things I'm curious about, if you delved into this within your book much, is this whole concept of belonging online. And what are the key elements that you found to that?
Yeah, so one of the things that when I set out to write this book, I definitely knew that I was, with my first book, with Fatheist, I was writing more about sort of my experience as an atheist, trying to find understanding with religious people and a sense of belonging within a community of like-minded non-believers. And so I was able to write very much about my own experience. But I knew with this book that my own experience was going to be insufficient, right? Because I've had sort of my own digital, experiences over the years, but my experience of the internet is going to be very different from everyone else's, really. And so at the very beginning of the book, I set out sort of knowing that I wanted to interview a lot of people about what their experiences online were like, especially, people who had very different experiences than mine. And I definitely, I think, again, we hear a lot about the kind of feelings of loneliness or alienation that young people in particular who spend a lot of their lives online feel. And I don't want to say that that's not true. It absolutely is. But I actually found more than anything that, the conversations I had when I was interviewing people over the years kept coming back to the ways that they had found sort of meaningful connection online. And I think that, as you say, I get into this in detail a lot in the book, but, just as there are kind of challenges to connecting online, there are also particular things that are specific to the ways that we can connect online that make it easier to find belonging than it sometimes has been, especially for people who are trying to find a sense of belonging, in terms of a kind of identity or a set of experiences or that sort of thing. I've read a lot about the ways that people use the internet to connect with each other. And one concept that I came across that I really liked was this idea of the internet cat fallacy. So anyone who spends a decent amount of time online is aware of the fact that there are a lot of cat memes on the internet. And there's this idea that, cat memes are sort of all over the internet, and that they're particularly popular online as opposed to sort of other, that they're disproportionately popular online, like cats are more popular online than they are offline. But actually, as it turns out, cats have always been really popular. They're one of the most popular, I think, more than dogs even. There are more cats living with people in the United States than dogs. But the kind of fallacy is not in the fact that cats are everywhere online. It's in this idea that they're suddenly everywhere, that cats are, popular because of the internet. What it actually reveals is that cats were always popular, but people who loved cats faced certain obstacles to becoming aware that other people loved cats too. Cats live indoors. So unlike, if you're out walking your dog, you can see other dog owners out and you can connect with each other that way, but you can't see who else on your block has cats.
That's wild.
Cats were also kind of stigmatized, for various reasons. People had a very different image of a cat owner than a dog owner. And so the author gets into all these, different aspects of this, but the point is that the internet made it possible for people who loved cats to find each other in ways that were more difficult before. And so there are things about the ways that the internet can connect us across geographic boundaries, across various stigmas that we might sort of experience around our identities, and also just the kind of the way that it allows us to be anonymous in certain respects, to kind of adopt various identities and try them out and experiment with them. I interviewed a lot of people who had sort of used the internet to kind of tiptoe into an identity or a way of understanding themselves. And so, I think the internet just cracks open our ability to forge connections in new ways that allow us to feel more human, more ourselves. Now, I do think there's loss in that, and that's something I talk about in the book too, where, I think there's something about being in a community and sort of being kind of held in that community and forced to kind of struggle with it as it, sort of goes into uncomfortable places that can be really valuable. Whereas online, if a connection that or a community that you're in starts to sort of go through something uncomfortable or struggle, you can just log off. And so I think, there are losses to that for sure. But that doesn't mean that we can't figure out how to sort of hold people in communities online and find ways of doing that. Just maybe right now we haven't quite figured that out yet.
So the book that you're coming out with, the IRL, is being published by Broadleaf Books, which has been affiliated a long time with the ELCA, Lutheran Church. So how does religion factor into your book and the different things that you talk about?
Yeah, it's funny you asked that because, they are a Lutheran affiliated publisher. I'm also teaching at a Lutheran affiliated college. I just can't seem to get away from the Lutherans.
Well, you're in Minnesota too, so I mean.
I am. That's definitely part of it. But it's funny when I first brought the book to them with my agent. Well, they actually reached out to us, but when we first started talking about this book that I was working on, religion really wasn't in the pitch anywhere. And actually, I think at that time I was like, because my first book was all about religion, so much of my work has been about religion. I was like, I'm doing something not about religion. I'm sort of moving on. And yet I found as I was writing it that, of course, religion was kind of showing up everywhere in it. And part of that is, right, my degrees are in religion. I teach religion now. I've been working, it's the air I breathe. But I also found that, like, the reason I was interested in this topic was specifically because my whole life, all my work and also just the way I live my life, what interests me is how people, make sense of their lives and where they find a sense of grounding and connection and identity and, all these things that are the questions that religion addresses. And so, I found that, I was interested in why and how we use the internet to wrestle with the big questions in life and to find a sense of belonging and a sense of identity, specifically for the same reasons that I've always been interested in religion. And so I think it's a book that in the sort of early in the book looks at, as I was saying earlier, this kind of demographic shift that we're experiencing right now as people are leaving religious institutions and moving into sort of digital space as they try to make sense of their lives. But it's also a book that basically looks at these sort of age-old questions of what it means to be human, what it means to belong, what it means to be real. These are the kinds of questions of religion, and I'm trying to look at them through the lens of our digital life and what digital life can teach us about these things. So even though I thought at the beginning that I wasn't writing a book, or I was writing a book that had nothing to do with religion at all, as it turned out, it was the opposite. And what I've learned from that is that, we are who we are. And
well, some of these very fundamental questions that you're talking about, are very fundamental to religion. So
exactly.
And
yeah, I mean, the reason, so I grew up non-religious and I became a Christian when I was 11 before eventually sort of leaving Christianity. And, what brought me into Christianity in the first place was these kinds of questions. I was trying to find a space where I could make sense of and wrestle with these questions. And the people I found who were just as consumed with those questions, who also wanted to wrestle with them, were Christians. It's just what I sort of happened into. It could have been any other community as well. And I ended up leaving Christianity because I was studying religion at a Lutheran university, and my religion professors really, encouraged me to ask myself why I believed the things I did. And it was through that process I came to recognize that I had become a Christian, not because it reflected the way I saw the world, but rather because I was looking for that space to be able to wrestle with those things. And I found it in Christianity. And so, those are the driving questions that have always kind of animated my life. And they're the kinds of questions that keep me interested in the conversation, that keep me, they're the reason I'm teaching in a religion and philosophy department now. And ultimately, they're the reason I wrote this book. And what I hope this book can help make space for those kinds of questions in our digital life, because again, so often we don't bring, even though those kinds of questions are at work in so much of what we do online, we internalize this idea that we're not supposed to really question our digital life or think too much about it, or even though it's so much of our life now, we just kind of go through the motions online. And so I hope the book can help create opportunities for people to, reflect on how they are using the internet to address these really important questions and these important needs that we have as humans.
I'm really looking forward to reading it, and I think, it really transcends religion. I mean, as we've been talking the whole time here, there's just so many fundamental shifts that we're in the midst of that are all, intertwined here. So I'll really be looking forward to reading it. So the book comes out October 20th for
That's right.
Those folks, right? That's the release date?
Yeah, I can't believe it's so soon.
And so you can pre-order it now.
Yes, yep, it's available now. I definitely, I encourage people to go right to the publisher's website if they'd like, Broadleaf. But also, this is a year when so much of life has moved online, and there's been a lot of positives about that, but also a lot of, especially small businesses are really struggling, including a lot of our independent bookstores that do so much for the literary community. And so I definitely encourage people to, look into their local bookstores as well, and order through them and support them if they can. I personally really miss walking through those kinds of bookstores and seeing what books I come across. And I hope that's an experience I'll be able to have when this pandemic has reached some kind of resolution. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I hope the launch goes well, despite
Thanks.
the fact that it's during a pandemic.
I know I've had to make peace with all these, because I wrote one book, came out 8 years ago, and I was working, full time and a half when it came out. And so I didn't get to do a lot of the kind of like touring and stuff with it. Also, it was my first book. I didn't really know what I was doing. I've definitely learned a lot over the years since. And so I had all these ideas about the bookstore tour, all that stuff. And of course, I've had to make peace with the fact that that's not happening. But exactly as we were saying earlier, I'm trying to think about what opportunities does having to do it a different way or reapproach how I'm doing it provide. And, one of them is being able to do more stuff like this where, I can connect with people who maybe wouldn't be able to get to a bookstore event, or who, whether they're limited by geography or, any number of things. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity, especially, the book's still not out for almost 2 months. And so to be able to talk with you now about it and get your questions and your perspective on it, I'm really grateful. So
well, my pleasure. I really was, looking forward to this conversation just because I know that the things you're dealing with are things that I've been dealing with and thinking a lot about, and, haven't figured out, obviously, what the future is going to look like tomorrow, much like 20 years from now or whatever. But
we're all headed into an unknown future, but there's, I think in that uncertainty, there's a lot that we can aspire for. And I think bringing a little bit more intention and purposefulness to our digital life will make a big difference. And it sounds like you're absolutely doing that. So I'm glad
trying, whether it's writing for your life or publishing in color or Compassionate Christianity, those are the main platforms that I lead, each with their own different objectives. And, I'm trying to do whatever I can to take advantage of this transition, this transformation that we're in. But, trying to figure that out and trying to do what you can within the constraints that we do have today is not obvious to pull
Yeah.
all the right levers.
We're all, I mean, exactly as I was saying earlier, we're amateurs, right? We're all kind of
Yeah.
trying our best and trying things. Some of the things that we're trying are not going to work. And, that's definitely on the first day of class yesterday to my students, I tried to make that as clear as possible that like, we're all trying something new. It's uncharted territory and we're all going to make some mistakes, but there's real value in making mistakes. Through that trial and error, we can learn new things about who we are, as long as we're open to that. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, I think, experimentation and learning, is even more valuable now than what it already was, which was already very valuable. But
Yeah.
it's a necessity now, and we've all got to do, I think, more experimenting and more learning and figuring
Absolutely.
out. Well, Chris, thanks again. I'm really looking forward to your launch. Let's stay in touch, and I'm sure there's some additional conversations we'll have down the road that will be.
That sounds great. That sounds great. Thanks so much.